Scholars Anna Lohrmann and Stefan Lindberg have argued that we are no longer in a third wave of democratization, but rather a third wave of autocratization. And indeed, it is true that several countries that transitioned to democracy during the third wave have become more autocratic in the past 5 years. We may not be in a full-on wave of dictatorships, but our recent global democratic moment has definitely plateaued. What exactly is democratic backsliding? The term refers generally to a democracy becoming more autocratic. While Nancy Bermeo describes 3 ways democracies can fall back into dictatorships: coups, executive aggrandizement, and electoral manipulation, backsliding is more typically used to refer to executive aggrandizement. This is efforts by elected officials to maintain power indefinitely, but through legal means. In this video, I'm going to talk about coups and backsliding, or democratic erosion, or executive aggrandizement, whatever you want to call it. First, coups. Traditional military coups happen when military officers take over a country. They take place in dictatorships as well as democracies, but I'm focused on democratic breakdown here, so I'll just talk about that kind. Sometimes mid-ranking officers, such as colonels, will conduct coups, but that actually is more often the case under dictatorship. When we're talking about coups against democracies, they tend to come from the senior ranks of the military. In these cases, the military will use their access to weapons to literally take control over key institutions in a country. They will occupy parliament, the TV station, limit internet access, and arrest the current head of state. Coups tend to happen when a military has a relatively strong position in the country and a specific grievance, such as poor economic performance or perceived mismanagement of a military conflict. In the past, the military would say they are taking power because they'll be able to better run the country than the elected government. Today, they tend to say they are rescuing the country from the current government and promise to hold elections within a certain time frame to restore democracy. For example, the August 2020 coup in Mali took place after months of protests against government corruption. In Turkey, in 2016, the military attempted a coup to avoid the further erosion of secularism and democracy in that country. And in 2014, the Thai military took control of the country after 6 months of political crisis, when street protests were occasionally violent. They eventually allowed elections to be held again in 2019. One thing these 3 cases share, aside from the military saving the country from an elected leader, is that all 3 of these countries have experienced repeated coups over time. This was Mali's second coup in 10 years. Turkey had 1 coup a decade, including coups by memorandum from 1960 to 1997. And Thailand definitely comes out on top on this list. They've had at least 7 coups since 1950. In cases like these, countries end up in what is called a coup trap. The military intervenes, attempts to set up democratic institutions that would resolve its concerns, is unsatisfied with their performance, and then intervenes again. Moving on to executive aggrandizement. In the past, when democratically elected leaders wanted to stay in power indefinitely, they would perform what is called a self-coup. Examples include Adolf Hitler in Germany and, more recently, Alberto Fujimori in Peru. In these cases, the leader, with the support of the military, suspends parliament and the constitution, instituting a form of military rule under a civilian leader. Leaders today generally use more subtle means to maintain power indefinitely. These include constitutional amendments and legislation that remove term limits, limit the ability of opposition parties and civil society to organize, and increase control over the media and court systems. For example, in Venezuela, Hugo Chavez was elected through free and fair elections in 1999, but passed a referendum later that year to allow him to change the constitution. He then essentially rewrote the constitution to give himself power by decree, extend the term of president, eliminate the Senate, and so on. Even more subtle changes, such as limits on the ability of NGOs to operate and media licensing requirements, can lead to a decline in the strength of democracy, since they reduce the ability of outside organizations to hold elected leaders accountable to citizens. Executive aggrandizement tends to happen when leaders are popular, but the public is generally disengaged from politics. For example, in Venezuela again, Chavez was quite popular, but turnout on the constitutional referendum was unusually low. In Hungary, Viktor Orban's party won 2/3 of the seats in parliament in 2010, which gave them sufficient power to amend the constitution on their own. This has been a brief description of the process by which democratic backsliding tends to happen. As to more general causes for why it happens, we're going to be talking about that more in class.